Hi, welcome to this episode of Knitting with QueerJoe. Glad to have you here. Have you ever wanted to sell your knitwear, or has anybody ever asked you to knit something for them for pay? Or donate something to a charity auction, for instance, where it's going to be sold and the benefits are going to be given to the charity that's auctioning it off. Today's episode is really about trying to figure out what are the attributes of a garment that are successful for the purpose of recouping some of the costs of your product materials and your labor associated with knitting. So grab your knitting. Please spend a few minutes with me knitting along, and while we discuss some of the successful attributes and some of the garments that and designs that I've used that actually comply with those requirements to have a successful garment. So my background is I've been doing craft shows for a number of years where I actually sell some of my knitting. Over the years, I started to whittle down the products that I actually make in such a way that they comply with a few different criteria, and I've started to codify that criteria in such a way where I know specifically which garments that I can make and make a decent profit on, or aren't too difficult to make and I enjoy making. I don't honestly think that you could ever make back in terms of the cost of a garment that you could charge a customer all the labor involved to make. There are certain exceptions to that, but in general, my knitting takes place while I watch television, for instance. So it's not like it requires my full attention, and so I don't really feel like I could require a fair wage, hourly wage for the amount of hours that goes into making a particular garment. That being said, I certainly do want to make up for at least the cost of the yarn, obviously, and some of my time when I'm selling a garment. So some of the things, one of the first criteria that I consider important in terms of deciding on what goes for sale, and this would be for an auction as well, is it can't be size specific. So sweaters, for instance, I consider to be not even considered a possible product in my craft shows, because it requires too many size differences to be able to say, yes, I could have a small, medium, and large in this cardigan. First of all, sweaters take up an enormous amount of time to make, even if you're making them in bulkier yarns. And the drape and fit are very specific to the people who are buying them, and so it's just way too complex to maintain an inventory, in my mind, that's going to be profitable when you're doing something like a sweater. So that alone limits your garments to things that aren't sized. So that's the first criteria that I have, that it doesn't really require sizing. There's one exception to that. I do make hats in kind of small, medium, and large, but they're pretty much the same hat. They pretty much use about the same amount of yarn, and so they're all priced the same, despite regardless of what size they are. The other thing is, or some of the other attributes are, I need to be able to produce them in a quick enough time frame where I can charge a decent hourly rate for my labor. Even though I don't consider myself able to recoup truly a fair labor wage associated with my knitting time, I do want to make sure that it doesn't take too much time. So it has to be relatively simple. I've started actually calculating my knitting time in terms of TV nights of knitting. So I do most of my knitting while I'm watching TV with my husband at night. And so if something typically takes one TV night of knitting, and the cost of the yarn isn't that much, I can charge a certain price for that. 2 TV nights of knitting is slightly more expensive, obviously, and if it's 3 or more, it's upward from there. The other thing is, I'm always looking for yarns that are either on sale or are just inexpensive to begin with, that I can make look really good. that's an important aspect to deciding on what goes into a successful, profitable, saleable garment when it comes to my knitting. The other thing that's important, I think, is deciding on what kind of fiber you want for your audience. Now, if you're making a lot of baby items for sale, for instance, you're clearly going to want things that are machine washable. That is not my customer base, so most of my items are knit in natural fibers, mostly wool. Sometimes wool synthetic blends like sock yarns, which have some nylon in them sometimes, that kind of thing. I also consider things like locally sourced yarns from local indie dyers or from locally produced mills and things like that, because my customer base sometimes finds that important. And the other two most important things associated with this is I need to make something that's aesthetically pleasing and catches the eye of the person coming by my craft show table, and also can be made quickly and at low cost. So given all that, I've kind of whittled down the product line that I keep at my craft shows to a few various things. The first one that I have learned works really well is just a simple hat. So I call this the West Coast watch cap. The West Coast watch cap is a very simple cap. It's got simple 1x1 ribbing at the bottom, and it's got simple decreases at the top. And this one does come in small, medium, and large sizes, but there's very little difference in terms of head sizes, and so it's very easy to create hats that fit virtually anyone. And I can bang these out in one night, in fact less than one TV night of knitting, and so I can charge a relatively low price. Now you can see that I use really vibrant colored yarns that are self-striping or patterned or variegated, and I find that to be an important piece of it. So the yarn I typically uses things like Noro, which has really vibrant colors and are really appealing to the audience that I'm trying to sell to. And so I can bang out a few dozen of these hats in terms of, and they all look different, and they all, and I can put them at a decent price point associated with the customers coming to look at it. I sell most, that is the most things that I sell at my craft shows are those multicolored hats. The other thing that you might want to consider as one of the attributes is making sure your design isn't a protected or trademarked design. Some of you may remember a while ago I knit up a couple baby surprise jackets by Elizabeth Zimmerman, and was considering selling them when it was pointed out by one of my readers, and I was grateful for it, that it was a trademark design and that I couldn't do it, or copyright design, I never remember the name of which copyright, I think, and that I couldn't make it for sale. And so I realized most of the designs have to be either free and available for being made if they're not my own designs, or they are my own designs. So I started designing a lot of things that that have all the attributes of a successful garment. And this is one of those. So I call this the crosshatch scarf. The crosshatch scarf is this open mesh scarf done in it's a cascade yarn. I think it's a blend of wool, silk, and mohair. I forget the name of the yarn. And but it comes in these nice long variegated striping colorways. And so the color is really important. The drape is really nice, and it's actually my own design, so I don't have to worry about somebody asking me not to sell something of their own design. And so that's an important aspect and attribute of it as well. The next one, and you've seen this scarf quite a bit, it is the most successful design that I've ever come up with, both in terms of selling for patterns and also in terms of selling at craft shows. This is the knitted cross-stitch scarf, And I just want to put that up there a little bit so you can see it a little closer up. This particular design uses fingering weight yarns, and so there are a ton of different indie dyers who do sock yarns. I initially started using Koigu's KPPPM, their merino, to do this, but it blends and mixes varying colorways and variegated yarns and self-striping yarns and patterned yarns in ways that are really pleasing, I think. And my customers seem to agree. It's one of those designs that they look at and they say, wow, even if they're a knitter, they look at that and they say, wow, I don't think I could do that. And yet I can still knit one of those scarves in 2 nights of TV knitting in such a way so it's knit quickly. The cost of the yarn isn't that much, and I can get a good price point on it. It presents as an incredibly good-looking gift when people are buying it, or something for themselves. Another similar garment to that matches all the attributes as well is the interlocking crochet scarf. So the interlocking crochet scarf is, I can actually knit this up faster, or crochet this up faster than the knitted cross-stitch scarf. And it uses the same fingering weight yarns, and it also has that same ability to blend and mix variegated self-patterning and self-striping yarns in a way that I think is really pleasing. In fact, I'll show you the current one that I'm working on and as part of current knitting a little bit later. Also in terms of, and I discussed this in the first episode of Knitting with QueerJoe, are the infinity scarves. This is once I was able to find a inexpensive, very nice colored patterning yarn like this, and this also has a little bit of glitter in it. I don't know if you can see the glitter in that. It doesn't show through. This glitter is kind of a purpley glitter, so you can kind of see it in the midst of the light blue color in that. But the infinity scarves are very easy to make because I make them on my circular sock knitting machine. They have an appeal. The color has a nice appeal for on the craft show table. And the labor obviously isn't that much, and the yarn isn't that much. So all in all, I can create a nice, easy gift or garment for somebody who's shopping for themselves, which happens often, and people are real thrilled with that. Finally, some of the more expensive things that I do are very simple knit lengthwise shawls. Finally, I also make a lot of shawls in very simple design, and this particular design is just a garter stripe scarf, or a shawl in this case. I can make them incredibly long. I make them lengthwise in such a way that the striping comes across along the horizontal width of the scarf, or shawl in this case, or wrap. And I always use 2 different colorways of yarn. And typically I try to use black as one of the colorways because people, for some reason, people always like to buy black items when it comes to craft show. I don't know why, but people seem to gravitate towards darker and black yarn items, which is fine. I'm not a particular fan of knitting with black yarns, but when I mix it in with some of the various colorways, it works out just fine. And so it's not at all difficult to make very large shawls like that. The nice part about making the garter striped shawls and scarves is that it's completely no thinking knitting. It's garter stitches, relatively easy to do, and so it's a nice, fast, efficient knit when it comes to that. So those are my attributes, and those are the standards that I use at my craft show, and those are the garments that I sell most of. And because I can both put a good price on it, they look really nice, and they have all the other attributes associated with being a successful garment. And that also applies to the auctions where people are looking at it from a, people want to be surprised by the aesthetic, graphic look of something when they go. And I'll talk about one more successful one, which is the graphic aesthetic of the chevron striped scarves that I make. I find them to be incredibly strong graphically, very easy to make, and they also fit the criteria. And I'll talk a little bit about that in current knitting. Speaking of which, let's go to current knitting. So we've already discussed it, but I'm working on the chevron striped scarf in purple, blood orange, it looks red, I understand, and kind of a nice bright limey green. I'm also working on, and right now I've gotten probably about 1/4 of a scarf done for that, but I'm also working on you can see my crochet hook is still in it, an interlocking crochet scarf. The interlocking crochet scarves, which was one of the garments I showed before, I'm knitting this up using the same colors of yarn that I used in my last finished object. If you can look back on the blog, you can see that. It's blending differently, but I really like it very much, and I think it'll do very well at a craft show. So thanks again for joining me for this episode of Knitting with QueerJoe. I hope you found it enjoyable and informational and even educational perhaps. Please, if you have any comments or if you have any requests for information, things like the links for all of the patterns that I showed here, I will put in the comments of the YouTube video. So if you're watching this on my blog, you can link directly to the YouTube video from there and look at the links for it. You can also ask any questions. Please leave comments on either the blog or the YouTube if you have any questions or just want to say hi and let me know what you're working on in knitting. I'm really enjoying these Knitting with QueerJoes and hope you are as well. It seems to be, especially in these days of sequestering at home, it seems to give me an outlet for socializing in a way that I couldn't possibly do if I didn't have this type of technology available. And so again, you can also subscribe to my videos, and so it will let you know anytime a new video comes out, and certainly like it and things like that as well. Thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you next time.